Music theory with Microsoft Excel. Scales built by negative intervals or negative modal distances. In other words, traveling in the counterclockwise direction, focusing in on the minor modes, which includes the Aeolian mode, otherwise known as the minor scale, the Dorian mode, the Phrygian mode, and we're throwing in the Locrian mode as well. So get ready and some coffee because you ain't never seen rockin' unless you excel at rockin' with Microsoft Excel. Or in Excel. If you don't have access to this workbook, that's okay because we basically built this from a blank worksheet but started in a prior presentation. So if you want to build this entire worksheet from a blank sheet, you could begin back there or just build the part of the worksheet that we're currently working on. If you do have access to this workbook, though, 4 tabs down below. Fretboard example practice blank, the fretboard tab having a simulated fretboard that we will refer to the example tab having in essence the answer key. The practice tab has pre-formatted cells, so you could practice the practice problem with less Excel formatting, but if you don't have any of that, that's okay because we'll be working in the blank tab where we started from scratch with a blank worksheet. We'll be continuing with, in essence, the blank part of the worksheet, practicing both our Excel skills as well as music skills at the same time. Let's go to the fretboard tab to get an idea of what we will be doing, looking at the intervals, looking at distance, in particular going in the negative or counterclockwise direction, trying not to let the current terminology throw us off from the optimal functional way to visualize the fretboard, which is as a map of the territory, kind of like the globe, with 7 continent destination locations, 5 non-continent pass-through locations like the oceans. We are visualizing the globe of the fretboard, above it, our head above this low or heavy E string closest to the ceiling, visualizing the fretboard as though it's spinning around like the planet, giving it 12 degrees of rotation that line up to the 12 keys or notes in the musical alphabet, typically picking rotation number 4, which is the 7-note collection related to the C major, but we could go to C sharp, D sharp, whatever. The whole thing would shift forward in all symmetrical format like the planet spinning around. Therefore, once we've chosen the collection of notes, we want to then name those points not by the note names primarily, but instead by the equivalent of continent names, which are like the permanent Nashville number system, which is another way to say the modes. 1 Ionian mode, 3 Phrygian mode, 4 Lydian mode, 6 Aeolian mode, and so on and so forth. We also want to learn all the distances between all of these modes, and we can compare all the distances that will get us to another continent from any continent that we start on. So if we start on the Ionian, and I'm trying to say, okay, how far do I have to go in terms of oceans and continents to get 2 continents up? So I'm trying to go 2 continents up, which is equivalent to 2 modal half steps, which would be the 3rd scale degree. If I make that the 1, we have to go 2 oceans up and 2 continents up. There's 4 total steps or notes up to do that. Is it the same if I do that from the 4th continent, which is the Lydian continent? If I want to go 2 continents up from there to land at another continent, then yes, it would be 4 oceans and continents, 2 oceans and 2 continents. But if we went up from the Aeolian and I want to go 2 continents up, or in other words, 2 modal half steps up, or the 3rd scale degree, if I make that the 1, that's only a 3 continent and ocean distance because there's only 1 ocean in between instead of 2. So if I went 4 up, I would land in the ocean. That's in essence what we're doing. But this time, we're going in the reverse or negative direction, which most people don't know at all, to go backwards, because in part the intervals aren't structured very well for naming conventions going in the counterclockwise direction, which would be to the left on the guitar or towards the ceiling. But we want to know that because we do need to go in that direction. So we're going, this would be 1 continent in the negative direction, 1 modal half step back, which you would think would be the negative scale degree backwards, but we don't really have scale degrees, so we have to think about how we can use our tools that are given to us to do the job that needs to be done, which is not just going around the racetrack like a race car, but also having the ability to go the other way. Okay, So let's go on over to the blank tab. And we've been taking our 12 notes in the musical alphabet. We picked using our formula, the 7-note collection we're going to work on by going whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. So we're going like around the block, but we're really picking the places that we want to stop at. Our friends' houses around the blocks, and we're avoiding those other ones because they have like wild dogs or something that attack you. And so you try not to stop there. You just go through them quickly, okay? And so we have then our collection of 7 notes here. We then have been looking at the scale degrees, which is all off by 1, or the modal distances, which are measuring from each of the nodes, which we can say here is the modal range for the Ionian node, basically building our scale around the Ionian node, noting that we went forward clockwise, and we also went counterclockwise, measuring from that point in terms of our 3 kind of measuring tools, 2 of them being similar, that being our modal half steps. So we're basically saying if I want to go 1 continent up, 2 continents up, 3 continents up, 1 continent back, 2 continent back, 3 continent back. The scale degrees is in essence the same naming convention, but it's off by 1 because of the mismeasurement. And then we're going to say how many continents and oceans, or in essence notes, does it take to go 1 continent up, 2 continent up, 3 continent up, and so on. And that's the note half steps, similar going in the reverse direction. And we did that from each of the major modes, comparing them, the Lydian and the Mixolydian, noting that there's one interval difference between each of the other modes, Lydian and Mixolydian, as compared to the main major mode, which is the Ionian. Similarly, now we're going to do the minor modes, and the main minor is the Aeolian, the minor scale. And if we compare the other minors to it, Dorian and Lydian, then we're going to have a similar kind of system. So we've already gone clockwise. Now we're just going to go counterclockwise. So I need to unhide some cells. I'm going to unhide. I'm going to go from X and travel on over here to CA, California. Right click and unhide. And then we're going to say, all right, there's the Dorian that I need to go up on. There's the Phrygian. And here's the Aeolian. And then we got the Locrian. Now, first, let's do the Aeolian, and let's compare that then to the major scale, the Ionian. This should be one of the most different. So I'm going to hide from here to here, everything from here to here, right-click and hide. So now we've got the major, which we're going to compare. Hold on a second. Something funny happened. Let me try that again. I'm going to go from the Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian, and then here, stopping at the Aeolian, right-click, and I said hide, not unhide. So there we have it. So now we're gonna compare the Aeolian and the Ionian, which are going to be substantially different, and then we will compare the other minor modes, Dorian, Phrygian, and then we'll go on to the Locrian. Okay, so we went going forward. If you go forward from the Aeolian, the modal ranges would be AA, AN, AI, AD, AP, AY, AX. In other words, we would be going from a 6-6 modal range, a 6-7, a 6-1, 6-2, 6-3, and then here's the modal half steps going forward. In other words, in order to get 1 continent up from the Aeolian continent, how many steps is it? That would be the second scale degree. It would be 2 continents and oceans, or notes up. In order to go 2 modal half steps up from continent 6, the Aeolian continent, it would be the 3rd scale degree. It would take 3 continents and oceans to get there. In order to go 3 continents up, or modal half steps from the Aeolian node, or node number 6, that would be the 4th scale degree. If we're thinking about it in scale degrees, it would be note half steps of 5. That would be continents and oceans. And then this is going to be the scale interval, and this is going to be the modal distance. So now let's just do the same thing, but we're going to be going in the counterclockwise or negative direction. So let's go ahead and copy this bit, and we've done this in the past, so it should all be able to move forward and paste relatively. So I won't go over the formulas again in detail because we looked at them in prior presentations. If you want to just type it in there, you can if you're just doing it for your own practice purposes. But we did fancy formulas in the past in Excel to get everything so we can copy all the relative scales and stuff over beautifully. I'm just going to then format paint this thing up top by going to the Home tab, Format Paint, and then we'll just make this nice and green. So there we have it. Okay, so let's just go in the negative direction now. So we're on the Aeolian node. We want to go back one continent from the Aeolian node. So the question is, how many steps back would that be? Where would I get to? I would get from the Aeolian to the Mixolydian. If I go backwards, that would be a 6-5 modal range, but we're going in the counterclockwise direction. We have a 6-5 modal range up here. That would be going in the clockwise direction, in which case we would have a 6 modal half step. Because here we would be going 6, 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Whereas here we're going counterclockwise 6 backwards to 5, which would be a -1. So it would be the -2nd scale degree if we had negative scale degrees, but we typically don't have negative scale degrees because the negative direction doesn't work very well in the scale degrees. So how many notes back would it be? It would be -2 notes back to get there. So the normal convention would be a -2 minor 7th. Why? Because 12 minus 2 would be 10, and 10 note forward would be a minor 7. Therefore, the minor 7 can be 10 forward or -2 backwards. I'd rather call it a -2 Aeolian -1st modal half step. All right, so notice that one, of course, is different than what we saw on the Aeolian, where we had a -1 major 7, because forward, that would be 11 forward. So this is going to be different. We have a different number of steps. It would take -2 steps to land on the continent if I'm going backwards, whereas if I was on the Ionian, it would be -1. All right, let's go to the next one. If I was going back from the Ionian, let's do it this way, back from the Ionian 2 continents, then I would land on the Aeolian. That would be a 1-6 modal range, but going counterclockwise. So it would be 2 modal half steps back, which would be the -3rd scale degree. How many continent and oceans back would it be? 3. -3 notes, -3rd, major 6. Why? Because going forward, 12 minus 3 would be 9. That would be a major 6. Therefore, major 6 can be going forward 9 or backwards 3. I'd rather call it a -3 note away from the Ionian node, -2nd modal half step. Why? Because you'd still get 9 on the notes going clockwise, but 7 minus 2 would make sense here, and it would be 5 going forward, which would be the 6th scale degree. On the Aeolian node, we're going to an AY modal range. If I go 2 continents backwards or counterclockwise, that would be a 6-4 modal range counterclockwise. So that's going to be -2 modal half steps, or -2 continents counterclockwise, which would be the -3rd scale degree if we had negative scale degrees. How many continents and oceans? It would be -4 backwards, which would be a -4 minor 6, because going forward 12 minus 4 would be 8, and that would be a minor 6. So minor 6 could be going forward 8 or -4, but I'd rather call it a -4 from the Aeolian node, -2nd modal half step, because going forward, it would be an 8 from the Aeolian mode, and then 7 minus 2 would be the 5th modal half step, which would be the 6th scale degree. Okay, if we go to the next one, if we go 3 continents backwards from the Ionian, you'd land on the Mixolydian. That would be a 1-5 modal range, but going counterclockwise, it would be going -3 modal half steps backwards, or 3 continents in the counterclockwise direction, which would be the -4th scale degree. How many continents and oceans would that be? -5 notes, which would be a -5 perfect 5th. Why? Because 12 minus 5 is 7, which would be a perfect 5th going forward. Perfect 5th could be forward 7 or backwards 5. I'd rather call it a -5 from the Ionian node, -3rd modal half step, because 7 minus 3, 7, 6, 5, 4 would be an Ionian, a 7 note away Ionian 4th modal half step, which makes sense going forward. Now, this one is a distance going forward of 7, backwards 5, which we want to recognize is solid and actually goes through the Ionian, not because it has a P, but because the distance is 5 backwards and 7 forwards. The distance should be telling us that that's going to go through and be both in the Ionian and the Aeolian. So if I go 3 continents counterclockwise from the Aeolian, I'll get to the Phrygian. That's a 6-3 modal range, or a -3 continents in the counterclockwise direction, which would be a -4th scale degree. If we had negative scale degrees, continents and oceans counterclockwise would be -5 notes, which would be a -5th perfect, a -5 note away perfect fifth. But again, I'd rather call it a -5 from the Aeolian node, -3rd modal half step. So you can see these are, in essence, the same. So what if I go 4 continents counterclockwise from the Ionian? I land on the Lydian. That would be a 1-4 modal range going counterclockwise. -4 continents counterclockwise direction would be the -5th scale degree. If we had -5 scale degrees, negative continents and oceans would be -7 counterclockwise notes, which would be a -7 perfect fourth, because 12 minus 7 would be 5 going forward. So perfect fourth could be 5 forward, -7 backwards. I'd rather call it a -7 from the Ionian node, -4th modal half step, because it makes more sense, because going forward would be a 5 note away from the Ionian node. 7 minus 4 would be a 3rd modal half step going forward. Now, again, I want to note not by the P here, but by the distance, -7, forward 5. That is a solid distance that is in both the Ionian and the main minor, the Aeolian node. So if I go 4 modal half steps back from the Aeolian, I get to the Dorian. That's a 6-2 modal range counterclockwise, which would be at -4 continents counterclockwise, -4 modal half steps, which would be -5 scale degrees if we had negative scale degrees, which would be -7 continent and oceans counterclockwise, or -7 notes, -7 perfect fourth, which I'd rather call a -7 from the Aeolian node, -4 modal half steps. What if we go 5 back from the Ionian? 5 continents counterclockwise, we would land on the Phrygian. That would be a 1-3 modal range counterclockwise. It would be -5 continents counterclockwise, or -5 modal half steps. Would be the -6 scale degree. If we had those, it would be how many continents and oceans counterclockwise? -8 notes away, which would be a -8 major third. Why? Because 12 minus 8 would be 4 going forward, which is a major third. Therefore, 4 forward or 8 backwards could be a major third in essence. But remember, the major isn't the important thing. It's the 8. So if I see an 8 distance backwards, then that's also 4 forwards in essence. And that's one that's going to be different in the major modes and the minor modes. So I'd rather call it a -8 from the Ionian node, -5th modal half step, because then it would still be 4 forward, this time from the Ionian node. 5 minus 7 would be -2 modal half, or 2 modal half steps clockwise. All right, and then if I compare that to the Aeolian, if I go 5 steps counterclockwise from the Aeolian, I'd land on the Ionian, which would be a 6-1 modal range, and that would be then 6-1 modal range, -5 continents counterclockwise, -5 modal half steps. It would be -6 scale degrees. That would be then continents and oceans, -9 notes counterclockwise, which would be a -9 minor third. And it's a minor third because going forward, 12 minus 9 would be a 2 note away major second. So wait a second. That's the wrong one. It would be a 3 note away minor third. So that means that the minor third could be going 3 clockwise or 9 counterclockwise. I'd rather call it a -9 note away from the Aeolian node, -5th modal half step. So did I get off one here? Let's go to the last one. There's going to be an ID. I'm going to go 6 counterclockwise, and that would get us to the Dorian. that would be a 1-2 modal range, but going counterclockwise, which would be -6 continents in the counterclockwise direction, -6 modal half steps, or -7 scale degrees if we had scale degrees. Going counterclockwise, which would be -10 continents and oceans, negative notes, and that would be a -10 major second. Why? Because 12 minus 10 would be going forward, would be 2 going forward, which would be a 2 note away major second. Therefore, the major second could be 2 forward or 10 backwards. I'd rather call it a -10 from the Ionian node, -6 modal half step, because it would still be 2 forward this time from the Ionian mode. 7 minus 1, though, would be first modal half step going in the clockwise direction. What about from the Aeolian mode? If I go -6 continents, I'm going to land on the Locrian. That would be a 6-7 modal range going counterclockwise, -6 continents in the counterclockwise direction, -6 modal half steps. In other words, -7th scale degree if we had negative scale degrees, which would be -10 continents and oceans in the counterclockwise direction, or -10 notes, which would be a -10, and I hesitated there. It's a -10 major second. Why? Because this is the one interval. If I go 12 minus 10, I get to a 2 note away major second. And this is the interval in the Aeolian that still has a major, meaning it's the same interval, but it's not a perfect. So that's the one that's a little bit weird that we have to just kind of memorize, even if you're going by the majors and minor kind of convention, because it's not a perfect convention, as we've discussed in the past. So I'd rather call it a -10 note away from the Aeolian node, -6 modal half step. Okay, so let's go ahead. Let's add the Dorian and the Phrygian, and then we'll compare that to the Aeolian, and then let's also add the Locrian. So I'm going to unhide. I'm going to go from X to BA, right click, and we will unhide these. And then I'm going to copy this bit right here. Boom, copy that, and I'll put that in the Dorian. And it looks like everything maps out properly. I'm also just going to paste it right over here in the Phrygian. Boom, Phrygian's mapping out, because look how beautiful it just works because of for formatting's sake. For formatting's sake, it worked because we did good formatting and formulas. All right, let's go back. This is how a good system should be generated. Let's go ahead and format paint, home tab, format paint, and paintbrushy this over here. And then we got to format paint and then paintbrushy this over here. So the color coding is proper. We cannot go forward if the colors are not properly aligned. Home tab, format paint, and then we will paintbrush this. Okay, there. Now we can do comparisons. Now I'm going to hide the Lydian and the Mixolydian and just compare the other minor modes and the Locrian mode to the main minor, the Aeolian. So let's go ahead and hide all these columns. Right click and hide those columns. Okay, so now let's go to the Dorian and let's just compare out the Dorian. So let's say we go one step counterclockwise. The Dorian is a minor mode, but it's going to have one interval difference from the main minor, which is the Aeolian. The Phrygian is a minor mode, but it will also have one interval difference than the main minor, which means that these two modes will also have two intervals different from each other. And then the Locrian is kind of like another minor, but it actually has two intervals different than the main minor because it's got one being similar to the Phrygian difference, and it has that crazy flat 5 that makes it's gone too far, makes it go crazy. Okay, let's go to the Dorian. Okay, so we're going to go one step back on the Dorian, one step counterclockwise, one modal half step back. Where would I land? We'd go from the Dorian to the Ionian. So that would be a 2-1 modal range in the counterclockwise direction, -1 modal half step counterclockwise, which would be the -2nd scale degree. How many continents and oceans would it be, or notes? In other words, -2 notes backwards. We would call that a -2 minor 7 because going forward it would be 12 minus 2, which would be a 10 note away major 7. So we could go major set or minor 7 could be forward 10 or backwards 2. I'd rather call it a negative 2 node away from the Dorian node, negative first modal half step, because going forward would still be 10 notes away from, this time, the Dorian, and it would be 7 minus 1 or 6 modal half steps going forward. What about the Phrygian? If we go to the Phrygian and I went one continent counterclockwise negative, we would land on the Dorian. That would be a 3-2 modal range counterclockwise, going one continent counterclockwise, or negative, one negative modal half step, which would be a negative second scale degree if we had negative 2 scale degrees, which would be how many notes backwards? That would be continents and oceans, negative 2 notes backwards, which would be once again, negative 2 minor 7 for the same reason, which I would like to call for the same reasons, a negative 2 from the Phrygian node, negative first modal half step, remembering that this negative is kind of following through to both numbers so that we don't have to type 2 of them. We're going to have the same thing from the Aeolian, because these are all minor modes, so this one's flowing all the way through. We have an A, one back would land on the Mixolydian. That would give us a 6-5 modal range, but in the counterclockwise direction, it would be negative 1 continent counterclockwise, negative 1 modal half step, negative second scale degree if we had negative scale degrees, which would be negative continent and oceans in the counterclockwise direction, negative notes, that is 2, negative 2 minor 7, which I'd rather call a negative 2 from the Aeolian node, negative first modal half step. What about the Locrian? Is it the same? If I go one continent backwards, I'm going to land on the Aeolian. That would be a 7-6 modal range counterclockwise, negative 1 modal half step counterclockwise direction, which would be the negative second scale degree. How many notes away? How many continents and oceans in the negative direction to get there? 2, which would once again be a negative 2 minor 7, or a negative 2 from the Locrian node, this time negative first modal half step. So that one follows all the way through on the minors and the Locrian. Okay, let's go to the next one. We go 2 continents backwards. I want to go 2 continents backwards from the Dorian. That would land us on the Locrian, and it would be a 2-7 modal range going counterclockwise, negative 2 continents in the counterclockwise direction, or negative 2 modal half steps, which would be the negative third scale degree if we had negative scale degrees. How many continents and oceans in the counterclockwise direction? Negative 3 notes, in other words. That would be a negative 3 major 6. Major 6? See, because if I go 12 minus 3, it would be 9, which would be a major 6. So that's the weird one, because normally, and you could see how I'm emphasizing the major, because I still have that in my mind, but I would like to be able to, and I'm training myself to break that habit, to see the negative 3 as the thing that makes me go, what? The Dorian has a negative 3, because that is not what all the other minor modes have, not the major thing, right? And I could see that because going forward, it's 9 notes away, not for a minor mode. Minor modes don't have a distance of 9 notes away. That's that's the major distance, right? Not the big M. That's not giving me any new information. That's what I want. Anyway, so I'd rather call it a negative 3 from the Dorian mode, negative second modal half step, which would still be 9 notes going forward, but this time from the Dorian node, and it would be a negative 5th modal half step, which was 7 minus 2, which makes more sense. Now that's going to be different from all the other minor modes, because they don't step out of line. Dorian stepped out of line with this one. So it's like if I go 2 modal half steps counterclockwise from the Phrygian, I land on the Ionian, which is a 3-1 modal range counterclockwise, negative 2 continents in the counterclockwise direction, negative 2 modal half steps, in other words, which would be the negative third scale degree if we had negative scale degrees, which would be a distance in continents and oceans counterclockwise of negative 4 notes, which would be a negative 4 minor 6, which is what you would expect, because 12 minus 4 would give you 8, and 8 is the distance as well as negative 4 that we expect to see in minor modes. And so but I'd rather call it a negative 4 from the Phrygian node, negative second modal half step, because you'd still have 8 notes away from the Phrygian node, but 7 minus 2 would be negative 5, would be 5 modal half steps going forward. What about from the Aeolian? Then if I go negative 2 continents counterclockwise from the Aeolian, I land on the Lydian. So that would be a 6-4 modal range going counterclockwise. Distance, -2 continents counterclockwise, which would be the -3rd scale degree. Continents and oceans counterclockwise would be -4 notes, which would be a -4 minor 6 once again, which I'd rather call once again -4, this time from the Aeolian node, -2nd modal half step. What about the Locrian? If I go -2 continents counterclockwise, I get to the Mixolydian. That would be a 7-5 modal range counterclockwise, -2 modal half steps or continents in the counterclockwise direction, which would be the -3rd scale degree if we had negative scale degrees, which would be a distance in continents and oceans, or in other words, negative notes of 4, meaning it was once again -4 minor 6. And which I'd rather call a -4 from the Locrian node, -2nd modal half step. All right, makes perfect sense. Let's go to the next one. What if I went 3 continents back from the Dorian? That would land me on the Aeolian, and that would be a 2-6 modal range counterclockwise, which would be -3 continents counterclockwise, or -3 modal half steps, which would be the -4th scale degree if we had negative scale degrees. How many continents and oceans or notes backwards would that be? -5. That would be a -5 perfect 5th. Why? Because going forward, 12 minus 5 would be 7, which is a perfect 5th. So a perfect 5th could be 7 forward or 5 backwards. The perfect should give me no new information if I have the -5, because that's the thing that's going to tell me that this is a standard interval that is in most, including the major, as we saw before. I'd rather call it a -5 from the Dorian mode, -3 modal half step, because once again, you'd have 7 going forward from the Dorian, but this time it would be 4, because it would be 7 minus 3 would be 4 modal half steps going in the clockwise direction. What if we go to the Phrygian? If I go 3 modal half steps or continents counterclockwise, I land on the Locrian. That's a 3-7 modal range counterclockwise, -3 continents counterclockwise or modal half steps, which would be the -4th scale degree if we had those, which would be continents and oceans or negative notes of 5, -5 perfect 5th, which would be, I'd rather say, a -5 from the Phrygian node, -3rd modal half step. All right, what about the Aeolian? If we go back 3 continents counterclockwise from the Aeolian, we land on the Phrygian. 6-3 modal range, -3 continents counterclockwise, or -3 modal half steps, -4th scale degree. If we had those, how many continents and oceans counterclockwise or notes would that be? -5. -5 perfect 5th, -5 from the Aeolian node, -3rd modal half step. What about on the Locrian? Here we go, crazy Locrian. We're going -3 continents counterclockwise. That lands me on the Lydian from the Locrian. That's a 7-4 modal range counterclockwise, -3 continents counterclockwise, -3 modal half steps, which once again would be the -4th scale degree if we had negative scale degrees, which would be continents and oceans of -6. That's the interval that it screeches in your ear as soon as you skicks. It's just like you hit it on the, it's like a chalkboard. So it's like, okay, that's the weird one, because that's going to be a -6, and I'm calling it a diminished 5th, but it should be an augmented 4th. We're not going to get into that whole thing again, but let's make that, no, that's right. Actually, it's right this time, diminished 5th. So if I went forward, 12 minus 6 would also be 6. So it's a 6 note away diminished 5th. So diminished 5th could be 6 going forward or 6 going backwards, but I'd rather call it a 6 note away from the Locrian node, -3rd modal half step, because that would still be 6 going forward from the Locrian node, but then if we take 7 minus 3, it would be 4 going forward. Let's make that one yellow to show that one's weird as compared to the as compared to the Aeolian. All right, let's go to the next one, to the next one, to the next one. We're on the Dorian. We're going up. We're going up from the Dorian back 4 continents counterclockwise. Where would we be? Where would we land? on the Mixolydian. That's a 2-5 modal range counterclockwise, -4 continents counterclockwise, or -4 modal half steps, which would be the -5th scale degree if we had negative scale degrees. How many notes and continents counterclockwise would that be? 7 notes counterclockwise. That would be a -7 perfect fourth, because 12 minus 7 would be 5 going forward, so the perfect fourth could be 5 forward, 7 backwards. The P doesn't give me new information as long as I have the -7, because that's the thing that should tell me that it's going to be fairly constant going through the other modes. The distance, not the P. The P is not important. I'd rather call it a -7 from the Dorian node, -4th modal half step, because we would still have 12 minus 7, 5 from the Dorian mode going forward, but 7 minus 4 would be the 3rd modal half step going clockwise direction, if we want to go around the block that way. What if I went -4 continents from the Phrygian node? Well, we would land then on the Aeolian node. That would be a 3-6 modal range going counterclockwise, -4 continents counterclockwise, or -4 modal half steps, -5th scale degree if we had negative scale degrees, distance in continents and oceans, or negative notes of 7, -7 perfect fourth, which I'd rather call once again a -7, this time from the Phrygian node, -4th modal half step. What about from the Aeolian? If I go -4 continents counterclockwise, I land on the Dorian. That would be a 6-2 modal range going counterclockwise, -4 continents counterclockwise, or -4 modal half steps, which would be the -5th scale degree if we had those, which would be notes and, or negative notes, which are continents and oceans of 7, -7 perfect fourth once again, which I'd rather call a -7 from the Aeolian node, -4th modal half step. What about the Locrian? Is the Locrian going to mess this up? We're going to go then -4 continents from the Locrian node. Where would we land? On the Phrygian. We're going to have a 7-3 modal range counterclockwise, -4 continents counterclockwise, -4 modal half steps, which would be -5th scale degree if we had those. It would be a distance of continents and oceans of, once again, -7. So the Locrian doesn't even throw this one off. Locrian's even cool with this one. So it's a -7 perfect fourth. So it's going to be a -7 from the Locrian node, -4th modal half step. Let's go to the next one. Otra vez, almost there. We have 5 continents in the counterclockwise direction from the Locrian node. That would land us on the Lydian. That's going to be a 2-4 modal range counterclockwise, -5 continents counterclockwise, or -5 modal half steps, which would get us to -6 scale degrees. If we had negative scale degrees, how many notes, which would be continent and oceans counterclockwise, -9 notes. That would be a -9 minor third, because 12 minus 9 would be 3 clockwise, which would be a minor third. Therefore, a minor third could be 3 clockwise or 9 counterclockwise. I'd rather call it a -9 note away from the Dorian node, -5th modal half step, because that would still be 3 forward, this time from the Dorian node, which would be 7 minus 5 or 2 modal half steps going forward. Now, this is the interval that's going to define whether something is a major or minor mode. So you would expect this one to be all the way through all the minors as well as the Dorian, because that is, in essence, what defines a minor mode. So the Phrygian, if I go 5 continents in the counterclockwise direction, would land me on the Mixolydian. That would be a 3-5 modal range counterclockwise, -5 continents counterclockwise direction, or -5 modal half steps, which would be the -6 scale degree. If we had negative scale degrees, how many notes, which would be like continents and ocean counterclockwise? It would be -9 notes, -9 minor third, which I'd rather call a -9 from the Phrygian node, -5th modal half step. What about the Aeolian? If I go -5 continents counterclockwise, I'm going to land on the Ionian continent, which would be a 6-1 modal range, but going counterclockwise, -5 continents counterclockwise, or -5 modal half steps, which would be -6 scale degrees if we had those, which would be continents and oceans, or in other words, negative notes of 9, -9 minor third, which I'd rather call a -9 from the Aeolian node, -5th modal half step. What about the Locrian? If I go -5 steps counterclockwise, I land on the Dorian node, which would be a 7-2 modal range counterclockwise, -5 continents counterclockwise, which would be -5 modal half steps 5, which would be -6 scale degree if we had those, negative continents and oceans, or negative notes of 9, negative 9 major third, which I'd rather call negative 9 from the Locrian node, negative fifth modal half steps. All right, one more round. What if we go 6 continents counterclockwise direction? We would land from the Dorian to the Phrygian. That would be a 2-3 modal range counterclockwise, negative 6 continents counterclockwise direction, which would be negative 6 modal half steps, negative 7th scale degree if we had those. Notes, which would be continents and oceans counterclockwise, negative 10 notes, negative 10 major second. Why? Because 12 minus 10 would be 2 forward, which would be a major second. So a major second could be 2 forward or 10 backwards. That's that weird interval that was in the minor modes. It's in the minor, it's in the Aeolian as well, even though it's labeled with that big M. So you can't really say, again, whether the M's are really helpful or not. We should be looking at it by distance, the 10 and the 2. So that means I'd rather call it a negative 10 from the Dorian node, negative 6 modal half step, because then going forward, it would still be 2, but this time from the Dorian node, and it would be 7 minus 6, or the first modal half step going forward or clockwise. What about from the Phrygian node? If I go negative 6 continents counterclockwise, that would be landing me on the Lydian. That would be a 3-4 modal range going counterclockwise, negative 6 modal half steps or continents counterclockwise, which would be negative 7 scale degrees if we had negative scale degrees, which would be a distance of continents and oceans, or negative notes of 11 this time. That's going to be a negative 11 minor second, because 12 minus 11 would be a clockwise distance of 1, which would be a minor second. Therefore, a minor second could be clockwise 1 or counterclockwise negative 11. I'd rather call it a negative 11 from the Phrygian node, negative 6 modal half step, because the clockwise direction would still be 1 from the Phrygian, but it would be 7 minus 1, or the first modal half step. I'm going to make this yellow on both sides because this is the one that is different from on the Phrygian side compared to the Aeolian, which is the main minor or minor scale. Because if we go to the Aeolian, it's going to be like the Dorian, not like the Phrygian, right? So if I say, what if I go negative 6 back, negative 6 continents from the Aeolian, that would land me on the crazy Locrian. That would be a 6-7 modal range counterclockwise, negative 6 continents counterclockwise, or negative 6 modal half steps would be negative 7 scale degrees. If we had negative scale degrees, what are the distance in notes, which is equivalent to continents and ocean counterclockwise? 10 notes negative. That would be a negative 10 note away major second. Why? Because 12 minus 10 would be 2. Counterclockwise direction, which is a major second. So a major second could be 2 forward or 10 backwards. So notice the Aeolian has this interval, which is the same as the major, which they labeled with an M, even though the main minor of the Aeolian has it. But the Phrygian is even more minor than the main minor in that aspect, because it has a minor if you go by the M's, the big M and the long. Anyways, I'd rather call it a negative 10 note away from the Aeolian node, negative 6 modal half step, because if I go the other way, it would still be 2 note away going forward. This time from the Aeolian node, 7 minus 6 would be the first modal half step going clockwise. What about the Locrian? Well, the Locrian's crazy. So it's going to be more minor than the main minor. It's going to be like the Phrygian, right? That's why the Locrian, again, is more different than the other minors. It has 2 intervals that are different than the main minor, being the minor scale, the Aeolian. So if I go negative 6 back from the Locrian node, negative 6 continents back would land me on the Ionian. That'd be a 6-1 modal range counterclockwise, negative 6 continents counterclockwise, or negative 6 modal half steps, which would be the negative 7th scale degree if we had negative scale degrees, which would be continents and oceans, or negative notes of 11 this time. So that would be an 11 note away minor second, because once again, 12 minus 11, which would be a clockwise distance of 1, a 1 note away is a minor second. So therefore, the minor second could be 1 note clockwise or negative 11 counterclockwise, which I'd rather say is a negative 11 notes away from the Locrian node, negative 6 modal half step, because the clockwise distance would still be 1 note away from the Locrian, but 7 minus 6 would be the first modal half step going clockwise. Whew. All right. let's unhide everything now. We'll unhide everything. And that's going to be the idea of it. And then, so these distances obviously seem somewhat overwhelming, but I just want to point out that if you look at the map of the territory this way, you actually have an objective that you can start to learn distances between continents like you would on the globe. Whereas you couldn't really do that in any systematic way that's coherent to a normal objective within context if you just try to learn all the distances between all the notes with no context. This is actually doable, okay, is what I'm trying to say. Whereas most people are approaching it in a way where it's not, it doesn't seem doable because it's so abstract. This is giving you the context to actually know what to memorize within the mapping system.